Hello, I think I'm live. Hello and welcome. My name is Isabelle Kent. I am an art historian and curator, and today I have the great joy of interviewing Kent Monkman for the Colonial Foundation. So Kent's going to appear on the Colonial Foundation Instagram account and join this chat in a second. This is the second in our series of interviews with artists and creatives whose work explores the old masters and reinterprets them for our modern age. And Kent's work certainly does that, as you will see. Welcome, everyone. Kent is an internationally renowned Cree artist working in Toronto, and he works in a number of mediums, including performance and installation, photography, video, but he is certainly best known for his monumental canvases in acrylic, these huge history paintings, two of which are currently on display in the Great Hall at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he's exhibited his work throughout the United States and throughout Canada, and also at various locations in Europe too. Kent's work explores themes surrounding the Indigenous experience in North America and the effects of colonialism, both in the past and today. And he uses old master painting and the Western canon of art history throughout his work in really fascinating and intriguing ways as a way of flipping the script, if you will, and changing those narratives that we thought we understood. But there's also a very strong vein of comedy and camp throughout Kent's work in his alter ego of Mischief Eagle Testicle, which we're going to be coming onto in a bit. So, as you'll agree, I think there's a lot to discuss here. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Kent. Let's see if he can join. Kent, are you there?
Hello.
Hi, welcome.
How you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Very good, thanks. Happy to be joining you today.
I'm very happy to have you, delighted. Where are you in the world today?
So right now I am in my country studio in Prince Edward County. It's about 2 hours east of Toronto, and I normally spend about half of my time here. But with the pandemic, I've actually been here for the past 3 months, and I've only been to Toronto twice. So since I've been out here, I've actually been quite productive, and I work with a team of younger artists in my atelier in Toronto, but they've all been transitioned to working at home. And so I've been out here kind of working solo, working on a number of different paintings and different projects like that.
Fantastic. Yeah, it must be so nice to have a bit of a retreat and your own space in the countryside. There's so much to discuss. I think from the introduction and from speaking with you previously, we have a lot to cover looking at the way that you use art history in your work. But I wanted to just start off by asking you, your art all has very strong messages to it, really strong things to take away. And I wanted to ask, what are you trying to achieve with your works of art? What are your big aims?
Well, I think, I chose this language of painting, this representational language of painting after working as an abstract painter for many years, because I felt like the abstract vocabulary of painting was limiting my ability to speak directly about some very important themes that I wanted to explore in my work, which have to do with the colonial experience. And for many of you who don't live in North America, the Indigenous experience here is one of being colonized, and the effects of colonialism are still with us on a daily basis. And we have all kinds of socioeconomic issues that are at the forefront of Indigenous life, and we face it on a daily basis. So I wanted a language of painting that could speak to these experiences, both past and present, because colonialism is still very much alive here in Canada and in North America. And I felt frustrated with the abstract language of painting, because people were often left outside the work. You know, you develop a very personal language, vocabulary, and then people are often puzzled by what your intentions are. So I decided to kind of return to my origins as a representational artist. I was actually trained as an illustrator because I wanted to have a use for my skills that I could find employment when I first started. There was always an intention to broaden and to be a painter, but I started out with training as an illustrator. And so when the time came when I finally discarded this language of abstract painting, I went back to look at art history. And it was in that examination of art history I realized that the art history of this continent was told primarily through the lens and the perspective of the settlers that were here. And I found all kinds of missing components in the story of this continent that did not reflect indigenous perspectives. And major things were missing from this art history, including the dispossession of land. So this is one of the biggest issues that we face as Indigenous people, where we once occupied 100% of the land. Here we now exist on 0.2% of the land of this continent, even though we signed treaties with the Canadian government to exist in partnership. We've been reduced to a very, very small fraction of our land base. And one of the things with the Colonial Project is that it also was intended to disrupt our cultural knowledge. And so there are many aspects to this Colonial Project. And what I've tried to do with my paintings is to touch on many of these different aspects and looking at art history, looking at this very, very rich history of Western painting to employ the narrative possibilities to bring that to my own experience and the experience of my family and my community, to authorize our experiences into art history, because we've essentially been erased. We've been erased from the land. We've been erased from the story of this continent, which is told really from one perspective. And you'll find that in the museums all throughout this continent, how the story of this continent is told from the perspective of the settler. So that's been one of my large or biggest mandates, is to really go into museums, to examine the work in the museums, and to kind of unpack it and challenge that subjectivity to bring forward Indigenous stories.
There's so much to unpack there, and I think everything that you've been talking about, you've done very successfully in a number of your projects, whether those be, I want to talk a little bit about your exhibitions where you're bringing objects in and juxtaposing them with your art. You've done that. You've also, your installations and your video art also does that. There's so many elements that you work within that. And also what you were saying about this language, you use this language of art history, which is from a Western tradition. And something, I was going to come onto this later, but I think because it's come up now, talking about this idea of language, do you ever, how do you feel about using something that is a Western language to try and talk about issues that are Indigenous issues? And do you sort of resent having to use that language? Because I know your early art, you incorporated Cree, the Cree language into that, and sort of Cree letters and writing. And so I wondered how you feel about that, needing to use this Western language.
Well, one of my main, I guess, drives is to communicate as widely as possible. And the sophistication of Western art and specifically of representational painting kind of reached its zenith in the 19th century, before it was eventually kind of like reduced and unpacked through modernism. But it's such a sophisticated language of visual communication that was kind of discarded by Western artists eventually in favor of abstraction and so on and conceptual art. But in its heyday, it was so sophisticated and so capable of communicating on so many layers that I could look at that objectively as a Cree person and say, you guys threw out your best stuff, and indigenous artists we never feel limited to to feel like we only have to work within our own cultural practices in terms of how we communicate, because look, we write novels, we write symphonies. Some of the best filmmakers in the world are indigenous filmmakers. Zacharias Canuck, an Inuit from Canada, won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. And so, it's about harnessing a sophisticated language and making it your own. And this is what I wanted to do with, this very sophisticated and wonderfully complex language of painting, was to use what I could learn from it and speak from an indigenous point of view, and therefore make it an indigenous language. So I see it as akin to any indigenous artist that works with that writes novels or symphonies and that kind of thing. So it's very similar.
Yeah. And it also gives people, as you're talking about language, it's all about communication and giving people a way in. And what art does so brilliantly, and I think particularly sort of old masters in these history paintings you're talking about, is making people curious, because they're complex images. They're images that, you can look at them on so many different levels. And so it's that curiosity and that feeling of curiosity that draws people in to want to learn more, and to learn more about the narratives that you're talking about in your paintings and various other art forms that you use, but also making you curious when you look at a Rubens painting or a Titian, to learn more about the myths and the stories behind that. Okay, let's go back a bit, because I wanted to ask you about your initial draw to art history and your early artistic education, because you grew up in Canada, and I was wondering what your early connections to art and to art history were like.
Well, I was fortunate, as a kid, I had parents that supported me as an artist, and I identified as an artist very early in life. So, I was the precocious kid that always got selected from our school to get the free Saturday morning art classes at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. I grew up in Winnipeg, and Winnipeg is it's an indigenous city. Like you go to Winnipeg, you step off the plane, you'll see the visible presence of indigenous people. I mean, there's so many of us. I think it has the highest per capita population in the country. And so I was fortunate that I was, encouraged as an artist very early, and I felt like I belonged at that museum. I would walk through the museum and see all kinds of paintings, and for me that was so inspirational, because I felt like I wanted to engage with that art history. But it wasn't until I kind of got to that point in my career where I had rejected this tradition of abstract painting, feeling frustrated with not being able to communicate, that I really went back to the art history to examine it. And that's when my eyes were really opened in terms of the profound possibilities that lay ahead, in terms of not just the challenge, the technical challenge of actually trying to meet this great tradition of painting. That was something that's taken me years, and it began with very small little paintings that I approached very cautiously, landscape paintings actually that were referencing the landscape painting tradition that was here in North America. As the settlers spread across the continent, they were looking at indigenous people, and they were looking at the landscape of North America, and they were making images of them. So that was where I began. And then I realized, this is a very deep subject, deep terrain, and eventually I became more drawn to history paintings, because history paintings were the ones that were so monumental in their authority, that really positioned the perspectives of the artist that made the work, or that the person that was commissioning them, and it really made those images profound and important to the public. So this is what I wanted to bring to the Canadian and to North American and an international audience, was glimpses into the Indigenous experience that has been erased from the art history, that was erased from the education system. I mean, you have people that have graduated from universities in this country, and they had no idea about residential schools. They probably have no idea that our populations are disproportionately represented in our prisons and penitentiaries. Sometimes 90% of the prison population in this country are Indigenous people. So we have many aspects that affect our lives profoundly as a result of the colonial project. And I'm just completing now a 3-year tour of an exhibition called Shame and Prejudice, which was my kind of response to the celebrations that Canada launched in 2017 when it turned 150 years of age. I was commissioned by the University of Toronto Art Museum to create an exhibition, and I wanted to make an exhibition that really asked Canadians to reflect on Indigenous experience in the last 150 years. What has it really meant for Indigenous people? So that exhibition broke down into 9 chapters, and each one of those chapters explored different aspects of colonialism here.
Yeah. And an image from that, I mean, there are many images that are incredibly powerful in that series, but the one of children being ripped from their mothers, from their parents, to go into these residential schools, which is such a striking image, such a strong image. And obviously the legacy of these residential schools, but also going right back to the sort of missionary and that whole experience as well is still, as you've expressed, is still very strongly felt and is really conveyed very strongly. The horror of this is conveyed so strongly in those works.
So the Scream became actually my most important painting because I guess, it just struck a nerve, because finally there was this very large scale history painting that conveyed the violence of ripping children from their parents. And, we still see this happening at the southern US border, where migrant children are being ripped from their parents. And so it's a genocidal act. And, it was deliberately omitted from school, education curriculums for many, many years. People are finally talking about it now. But, educators across the country just latched onto that image because it was a visual way to talk about these histories. And I based that image on many accounts that were published in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was finally published in 2015. And that was a document that where many thousands of Indigenous people were interviewed, and their experiences were published in the TRC report. And so that image, the violence of that image was described many, many, many times by Mounties and priests and nuns coming into an Indigenous village, and, the children being ripped from their parents and taken away. And so many of those children did not survive. And so I thought of, again, when I was thinking of, compositional inspiration, I thought of the Massacre of the Innocents, which of course has been painted many times in art history by the old masters. And that really informed the compositional elements and the violence, the histrionic poses of those characters that are in the painting, to communicate the horror and the violence of that act.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, the Massacre of the Innocents is something that, is such a popular subject matter for something so violent. It's so popular in the history of art and in Christian art. And actually, the interview that we did last week, the first one of this series with Matt Collishaw, he similarly used the Massacre of the Innocents, as a way of discussing, violence and horror. And it's so interesting that subject matter resonates so strongly today. And also looking at that image, the Scream, it reminded me of how the other side, the sort of the Western viewpoint of, taking Indigenous people under their wing, and that whole idea of, bringing them into Christianity, which is something that is steeped in art, is still on display. I mean, in just a month before lockdown, I saw 2 versions of the same sculpture of San Junipero Serra, where he is holding this, very fatherly hand. San Junipero, for those of you watching who don't know, he was a missionary saint, Franciscan, and set up a lot of missionaries in California. And it's this picture of him very sort of fatherly holding this young indigenous child. And I remember seeing that and it being very uncomfortable, but that's quite a recent sculpture that was put up, in honor of this man. And the counterbalance with your image of the violence and redressing this and seeing sort of it's not even the other side of the story, it's just the true story, right? Mm-hmm. And the truth behind this is incredibly important and sort of shocking that it's taken so long to have these images, for someone to come along and produce these images. So it's really fantastic that you're doing this. I wanted to go back. Can we go back to your landscapes and your initial look at these large landscapes? I'm particularly taken with your Trappers of Men, a huge painting, which is like is it based on a Thomas Cole landscape or one of these sort of huge 19th century American landscapes? But then you have all of these kind of jokey references to art history along the bottom. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about that and what that painting was trying to do.
So it's based on an Albert Bierstadt painting, and I was immediately drawn to Albert Bierstadt because one of the themes I'd been exploring in my work was the impact of Christianity on indigenous people. And I'd been doing that with those Cree syllabics paintings, because all those Cree syllabics were actually Christian hymns that had been translated into the syllabics and were used in a church where my great-grandmother was being basically indoctrinated into Christianity. So one of the main themes was the impact of Christianity, and it has had so much effect on indigenous people. Everything from the residential schools to how we see and understand our own understanding of gender and sexuality. So indigenous sexuality was really affected by Christianity. So one of the things, one of the reasons why I was so drawn to Albert Bierstadt was because his paintings had this biblical quality to them, and there was this, this very romantic sort of clouds that were, had these shafts of light. It's almost like God himself was there giving the blessing. Yeah, the Garden of Eden was giving his blessing to these settlers who were, going across North America, occupying what they believed to be unoccupied land. Well, of course, it was not unoccupied. There were hundreds and hundreds of nations of indigenous people living all throughout North America. So it was very much about the intention of the settlers, but also in their beliefs. And so I found a way, with looking at those Albert Bierstadt paintings, to find, they were very theatrical too. So it kind of, they were perfect for kind of staging scenes in them. You could find almost center stage in those paintings very easily. And that's where I started to situate my alter ego. And I created Mischief, Eagle Testicle, to talk about many things, but one is the ego of the artist and what motivates us and what we are trying to say with our work. But I wanted to reverse the gaze with this character, and I wanted her to kind of be looking back at the European and turning the European into her subject. And also with that character, I wanted to convey a very empowered understanding of indigenous sexuality, so that that indigenous people in our own communities can be aware, as well as others, that we had a place for what we call two-spirit people, but anyone who's in the LGBTQ spectrum were accepted in the indigenous communities of North America. And traditionally, even for people who wanted to live in the other gender, there was a place for that in our societies. So that was misunderstood. This is one of the many things that was misunderstood when the Europeans arrived, because they had such a binary, limited understanding of gender and sexuality. So as I dug through this, canon of art history in North America, I came across another artist that I've referenced many times, George Catlin. And George Catlin became a very interesting character. He was a man of contradictions. On one hand, he purported to be this sort of faithful documentarian of indigenous people, and then when he came across things that didn't really suit his his Moors.
Viewpoint.
You know,
Like the dance with the birdash, which
yeah, that's
you
right.
have your painting at the Hirshhorn right now. That's
Right.
referencing this dance of this to celebrate this person who is a two-spirit. Is that
Hmm.
right?
That's
That's the
correct. Yeah.
tradition that it's referencing.
So,
Yeah.
but you know, it really began with looking at Albert Bierstadt's paintings because you know they were essentially promoting the empty wilderness. You know, like they were essentially adverts for empty real estate that you know was for sale. And many of his paintings are empty. You know, that with the exception of the occasional animal or deer or even tiny little indigenous person kind of living in nature there. So these paintings really reinforced very diminutive kind of ideas of indigenous people of that time. And then these paintings were also kind of upheld in the museums of this country for many years, and still are in some museums, you know, as the authoritative version of the story of this continent. So it became really important for me to engage with museums as much as it became important to engage with the art itself. I had to find a way to work with museums to challenge these kind of very limited perspectives. And this is what was so fantastic about the opportunity at the Metropolitan Museum was to be invited to work directly with their collection to bring some of these things to the forefront.
Yeah. Well, that moves incredibly smoothly and perfectly on to talking about those Met commissions. You have these two monumental, I mean, I cannot overstate how big they are when you see them as installation shots. About 6 meters, I think, wide, long, and 3.5 meters high. I mean, really huge works that are currently in the Great Hall of the Met. And the Met, of course, is this, you know, bastion of Western viewpoint, of the Western viewpoint. And so I wondered, how did this commission come about? And yeah, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about those two paintings.
For sure. So, you know, Max Hollein, the new director, realized that, you know, they have this repository of world cultures, yet that story of the world was still being told through a very limited kind of European or Western lens. So he wanted to encourage artists from other backgrounds to engage with the collection. And so the first commission was Wangechi Mutu, and then I was the second one, the first commission for the Great Hall. And it was an opportunity, you know, it sends a strong signal to the other museums in North America because they've taken leadership. But, you know, Canadian museums are ahead in many ways of American institutions in terms of changing how they work with Indigenous collections, but also finding better representation, more balanced representation for Indigenous artists and our points of view. So here was the Met sort of taking leadership in the United States. And they had, I think, been familiar with my work. It had come across, they come across it a few years earlier when they were researching another exhibition on the Plains people. And because I'm Cree, but I'm not Plains Cree, I didn't fit into that exhibition, but they were interested in my work. And so here was an opportunity when this commission came up to engage with me. And, you know, I've done several museum-based projects already, so it's kind of within my wheelhouse to work with museum collections and to dig through, find things of inspiration, sometimes curate those things along with my own work, but to make work in response to the things that I found. And, you know, you can't, I mean, it's one of the best collections in the world, so it was pretty easy to find lots of inspiration there. And I decided instead of, you know, I mean, you could just spend days and days going through their vaults, but I decided to really focus more on some of their greatest hits because, you know, for the average museum viewer, I wanted them to be able to say, oh, I recognize that. That's a Venus and Adonis, that's Rubens, or that's Titian, and that's a Delacroix quote. So it was a way to, you know, have an interesting, an exciting conversation with them about their collection. And the first thing I did was go to representations of Indigenous people made in the 19th century. And, you know, so one of those was a Delacroix painting.
In the courtyard, the American wing,
That's right, and beautiful marble sculptures there, and so it began with that, and But I was fortunate in that I was kind of at the right point in my career to take on something like this, because I had spent a number of years developing my studio practice, much in the same way that the old masters worked with their atelier system with younger artists and training them and slowly kind of building a practice that would allow other artists to assist me and make these large works, because it would have been absolutely impossible for me to try and make these paintings in the limited time that we had. And so my practice was already kind of scaled up to that. And when the Met came knocking, I was ready and excited to take on a project of that scale.
Yeah. Again, I feel like every answer, there's so many things I want to unpack in every answer you're giving. But because you've just talked about your studio practice, I mean, the more I was looking at your work and researching it, more I just feel like you're sort of a modern Rubens. You have the studio practice, you work on sketches, you work in large history paintings. And could you just unpack that process a little bit? How does it get from idea to finished product?
So for sure, several years ago, I was doing everything myself. I was drawing and I was making the studies, and then I was going to the larger ones, and then I started to work with assistants, and they would help me, but they'd only be able to help me to a certain point. And then, there was a gap between the information they had in the study and where they needed to take it in the large painting. And so, with my team, we developed techniques in my studio where we decided to actually do photo shoots with models. And I had done. I always thought that, using a photo was cheating, I'm so, I just love drawing. I love the process of taking an image from a sketch and taking it all the way to the final thing. But it became impractical in the sense that, it was just limiting in terms of, how many hours were required to make, a large scale painting like that. So we developed over the last few years techniques where we work with models, and, I direct that all the way through, everything from the lighting to the costuming. So I'm very hands-on in terms of, how we pose the models. And then the young artists are trained in my studio to paint with the techniques that I use. So they're all taught to work in the same way that I build a painting. They help me build Rubens, it. Yeah, absolutely. And Rubens was one of my heroes for that reason, because he was able to run a studio with many assistants. And I remember being in the Louvre and being in the Rubens room with the Medici paintings, and just being so completely perplexed as to how an artist could make that many paintings in the span of about 4 years. It just blew me away, and I thought, this is what I need to do. I need to figure this out. So it took the collaboration of some very very smart and talented collaborators in my studio team to come up with these techniques that we use now.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny you should mention the Medici paintings, because again, looking through your work, I'm thinking the only thing missing is tapestries. Going to the next, top notch in terms of sort of the historic authorities or like levels of great art. I think you need to produce some great tapestries sometime. Okay, let's go back to the Met pictures, because they are just so extraordinary, and they are full of these quotations, but again, quotations that you're using, even though they're very, very, very famous works, and could be thought of as sort of pastiche or anything like that if they were used by another artist. You're using these works really as a way of getting people in and getting people in to engage with these. And so I wondered if we could look at the second of the paintings, the one that is looking at Washington crossing the Delaware, and sort of talking about what you wanted to do with that painting.
So, for Indigenous people, when we walk into museums like the Met and we see these grand history paintings that celebrate, the settler version of, the colonization of this country, by a slave trader and a genocidal maniac who burned Indigenous villages to the ground. I mean, we have a really hard time with that. And, one of my projects was to authorize our experiences into this grand scale of history painting, but also so that we would feel like we belonged. We're part of this story. We are part of the relationships often fraught with violence and conflict. Like I said at the beginning of this conversation, we've been dispossessed of our land here. And so we've been dispossessed also of the ability to be in conversation about the telling of the story. So it was very important for me to engage with, one of the greatest hits of the Met, Washington crossing the Delaware. And so that for me was, one of the images that resonated that I wanted to kind of, challenge, but also to sort of bring a twist to that.
Oh, sorry, I think I lost you for a second.
No, I'm here. Are you there?
Okay, I'm here too.
Okay, good. Yeah.
I missed the end of that sentence.
No, it was just about it was just about wanting to do a twist on that monumental painting, because Washington is the hero, and I wanted my alter ego to basically be the hero of that painting, and where she is kind of taking leadership and helping her own people, the Cree people. Mm-hmm.
But also in the boat, along with the Cree people and the other indigenous people in the boat, there's also people who are clearly African slaves who are brought over, and other people who have been sort of dispossessed. And so I wondered, do you aim in your work to look sort of more broadly at sort of the issues with the whole colonial experience, not just indigenous people?
Absolutely. This was an opportunity to speak about other colonial experiences, but primarily it's about wanting to speak to the world and wanting to position our experiences with other experiences of other people that have been colonized in different parts of the world. And it was an opportunity to talk about our values too, and the things that are important to Cree people. And if you, for us, there are many laws that guide how we are to be good human beings. And so there are things that there's Wakotowin, which is to basically be in kinship with other beings, all beings, living beings, and that includes the settler population. And when we signed our treaties with the settlers, our understanding was that we went into kinship with them. So Wakotowin is about being in kinship with the settlers, actually.
Mm. And I think that idea definitely comes across, that gaze. We're always talking about gazes in art history. You've got the male gaze, the colonial gaze, the female gaze is starting to be explored a bit. But your gaze in your art, it does seem to have that that sort of morality behind it, or that culture behind it, that is, there's a generosity there. And I mean, do you think about that when you think about sort of what is your gaze trying to do? Or do you define your gaze? I don't know.
Well, I think I try to impart with that gaze many of the aspects of our culture that are probably misunderstood or even overlooked by the dominant society, that don't understand that our culture in many ways has been one of acceptance. And this is why we had places for indigenous, or sorry, for people who lived in the other gender. This is why we didn't judge people for sexual practices that fell outside the binary of male female. Like, indigenous thinking is much more accepting in terms of how we see others and how we see the world. And in many ways, it's that it was it was perceived as weakness, by Europeans, and this is why I think a lot of indigenous people were kind of trampled over, because we have such an openness and a way of understanding and acceptance of people that fall outside of our own cultural thinking. Yeah.
And I think that definitely does come across in your art. The poses that people, the way that even when the indigenous people in your art are being attacked by white settlers, there's still, there's in your Welcoming the Newcomers, you have Mischief, she's holding out her hand, but then she's crying, and she's got this sort of mascara running down her cheeks, because she knows, even though it's part of the message to be generous, to reach out your hand, she knows what will come of that. And as the time traveler, as you've called her, this time traveler who knows about what will happen in the future. And yeah, it's very powerful.
Well, I think it's a value that I like to aspire to basically cultivate in my own studio too, which is one of generosity. Because when you collaborate with people, you'll get the best from people if you are generous with them, and if you give them you know, credit when it's due, and that you also encourage and respect and appreciate their talents. And so it's something that's in my art. It's how I see the world, and it's what I impart in my relationships. And it's definitely something that I abide by in my studio. And I think that kind of that those values of generosity is also, you get so much back, you know, in return.
And also it makes your art, you know, not only is Mischief putting out her arm, your art is also doing that for people who don't necessarily have very much knowledge, you know, who don't have understanding, who could, you know, feel like they were, you know, responsible for this because it was their ancestors and they're perpetuating the system. You know, you could have art that's very confrontational in that way, but your art doesn't do that. It sort of welcomes people in to understand more, which I think is a really fantastic thing, and really great. So well done.
Thank you.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the way that your objects, I'm realizing we're running out of time a little bit, but the way that you use your objects or your artwork, juxtaposing it with objects within the museum, and particularly in this exhibition that's just been touring, that you were talking about earlier, what's your process for using museum objects and bringing them into a sort of a more contemporary art context?
Well, it was a way to reframe the dialogue about some of those historic objects, and a way for people to think differently about the things that they sort of glaze over when they go through a museum and they don't really think about it. So some of those things were, you know, objects that I chose that could open the dialogue and sort of shift the conversation. And sometimes, you know, I would find something and I would include it in the paintings, you know. So it was a way to kind of create layers within the exhibition, within the artworks themselves, and basically animate conversation about history, which often people find static and kind of dull or boring. But, you know, for me, it's anything but. It's a very exciting terrain to be engaged with, because it's also how we can move forward, you know, with more insight to the shared histories that we actually have, and we have shared for hundreds of years. So I feel like it's a very rich terrain for my own practice.
Yeah, and objects can speak so deeply. I remember the first time I went to the Met when I was 13, I remember walking from there's the ancient Roman and Greek wing, and then you walk into the African art wing, and just thinking, you know, how can anyone think that one, you know, race or one ethnicity better than the other, because it's just this, you know, the universal human creativity. And so if that's brought to the forefront, rather than, you know, a hierarchy of saying, okay, the Western canon is, you know, what we should look to and what we should respect more, if actually what's brought to the forefront is that sort of universal human creativity, then hopefully that will lead to further steps in people's, you know, understanding and not being racist, basically, you know.
Absolutely. And
so, yeah.
You know, and one of my strategies was to seduce people. And I feel like that has been effective, because when you know, when those large landscapes were first, you know, put into museums, you know, people go, oh, that's so gorgeous, and they move towards it, and then they have to be quite close before they realize that I've kind of really messed around with the narrative.
Yeah. Oh,
and so it's a way
on in the corner, or, you know,
and you know, when you can get people to laugh, you know, they're open, and their heart is open, and their head is in a different place, and they can start thinking differently about some of these preconceived ideas that they have about Indigenous people and about the histories of North America.
Yeah. No, I think you definitely succeed on the seduction front, and, you know, drawing people in like that. Kent, are you open to showing us a work of art?
Sure, I'll show you one painting, which is kind of, well, it's based loosely, you know, there's a few references here, but I love Goya. You know, I've been looking at Goya, and one thing that I loved about Goya's work, well, one period, was his Madhouse series.
Yeah.
And a few years ago, I was thinking about, how do I communicate in a painting the psychological or emotional effect of being colonized? You know, we have varying degrees of trauma in our communities that result from intergenerational trauma of our people being in residential schools or being put in prison, and basically generations of having us removed from our own land. And so I looked at Goya for. Can you see that? Okay.
Yeah, I can. Wow. Okay, I wish I could expand it on the screen.
So this painting here, what I was when I was talking earlier about, the disproportionate incarceration of Indigenous people, like we have men and women just filling our prisons here. And why is that? Well, it's part of the colonial project. It's a legacy that comes from generations of our people being removed from their parents, put into residential schools, and where they lose their language, they lose their connection to culture, or they're put into the foster care system. And there's different institutions. It's not just prisons, but the institution, the foster care system here. And so this painting was a way to kind of think of, and to try and communicate. There's obviously some violence here that relates to other paintings in art history that show that kind of the violence, whether it's the massacre of the Innocents or the rape of the Sabine women. Yeah. But there's definitely quotations here in terms of that, and you can see angels hovering over. So there's this kind of
and also Mischief. We've got her,
and Mischief is Mischief is in this one as well. So. This is where this is kind of one of my most recent works that I was working on here in lockdown, and but that gives you an idea of at least one series here that's currently in process, and it'll be finished soon.
Yeah, amazing. No, thank you so much for showing us. It also has a sort of a Hieronymus Bosch kind of feeling of like a chaos madhouse, spread of one of his paintings. But no, I was particularly excited about the Goya reference, because I'm a great lover of Goya, and I saw you were referencing the Witch's Sabbath in another one of these paintings from this, talking about incarceration and talking about these sorts of issues. So thank you so much for showing us that.
My pleasure.
I think I've probably taken up enough of your time, and what a high note to end on, to see one of your works. But thank you so much, Kent, for speaking with me today and for taking the time to talk about your art, and for looking at Old Masters in such a nuanced and important way. So, well,
I'm a huge fan of the Old Masters, and I derive so much inspiration from the Old Masters and that tradition of painting. So for me, it's exciting, and I love engaging in conversation about it.
No, thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight, and I look forward to seeing where your art goes in the future, and hopefully we can meet in person sometime.
I would love that.
If you're in the UK, you need to bring your art to the UK sometime. I'd love to see it here.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for watching. All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.